Hi, Cara.
Oh, hello, Vanessa.
So we're in for some fun today. This is going to be a lively conversation.
Because the title is Suck It Up Parenting.
Yes. And because we've had an interesting experience on social media recently where I posted a reel about basically what to say and what not to say to a college kid coming home for the holidays.
A highly viral reel.
A highly viral reel, as viral as the norovirus reel. You like that reference?
I do. That was a personal reference, everyone. Don't ask.
And it was basically like, hey, when college kids come home, and it's funny because I didn't intend it as a reel intended for parents. I intended it for all those relatives that kids are going to see at Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas lunch and so on and so forth. And it was basically like, hey, don't ask a kid, do you love school so much? Is it so amazing? Are you having the best time ever? Because a lot of kids aren't, and that's just going to make them feel crappy. And I said, you know what? Don't interrogate them about their grades or their romantic life. Or whether they have a best friend, because again, they may have none of those things, or they may have just broken up with someone, or they might be really struggling in their classes and deeply embarrassed about that, right? Basically, just let a kid come home and make sure they know they are loved and you're super happy to see them. And most of the comments.
I'm just going to pause and say, it's good advice.
It is good advice. It's the right advice.
It's like, I mean, I'm not saying they're winners and losers here, but that's a winning piece of advice, Vanessa.
There's no way you're going to go wrong with that advice.
You're not going wrong.
There were some interesting comments that were like, not everybody's having this experience and just be aware. And so it's great. Like I'm all for caveats. I love getting constructive feedback in a variety of ways. I think it's awesome. There's always things we haven't thought of. And most of the comments were like, oh my God, this is so helpful. I had all this stuff planned for my kid, and now I realize how exhausted they're going to be. Or, oh, I totally blew it. I'm going to take a do-over at Christmas because I said all the wrong things at Thanksgiving. And of course, we all blew it all the time, and we all take do-overs, so no problem. Right? It was like, great. Everybody's on board. Except there was this not so kumbaya with a particular group of folks who I have to imagine are not usual followers of @LessAwkward, the Instagram handle where this was posted.
We have picked up a number of new followers lately. Maybe this is a new subdivision.
We have, but this subdivision, I don't think we're actually followers, because their reaction was essentially like, who the hell is this lady? Why is she telling me how to parent my kid? You don't ask those questions? Well, then your kid is never going to learn how to cope. And how are they ever going to be resilient? And your kid can just suck it up because they've lived under your roof and now you deserve answers. And it was along that vein. Someone else was like, I'm not raising a snowflake. I can ask my kid any question I want. And other ones were like, what do you not speak to your kid the whole semester? And, I know everything that's happening in my child's life.
Again, I'm going to pause. I'm going to be like the two Muppets up in the corner of the opera.
Two grumpy old men.
You know who I'm talking about. And I'm just going to say, haters going to hate, right? I mean.
Oh, and I didn't take it personally. I was entertained by it.
But what's amazing is you read the comments.
And I don't normally read the comments, but then when we decided that we were noticing a phenomenon that we'll term suck it up parenting, then I went back
and
really read
the
comments because I was like, oh, yeah, I gotta do a deep dive.
And there is a world of people out there who believe what you were reading.
The comments. Yes.
The commenters exist. It wasn't AI bots. There is a world of people who believe in suck it up parenting.
So today's episode is not about my hurt feelings at being attacked by comments on social media. Today's episode is actually about the research and the perspective as to why suck it up parenting does not work. And not only does it not work in terms of getting answers to your questions, it also doesn't work in terms of your kids' emotional well-being and mental health. And it does not work in terms of preparing them for an adulthood where they can handle things like anger issues.
Right. I mean, I think when you pitched this idea of this episode, which you pitched with more enthusiasm than usual, and you got a lot of enthusiasm, Vanessa. So it was very, very enthusiastic pitch. You basically said to me, I think there's a misperception that suck it up parenting is resilience building or grit building. And it is our responsibility to shine a light on the fact that those two things are not one and the same.
Right. And we are actually going to do an episode later in the season on building resilience in kids. And in the meantime, you can go back to Eliza Pressman's book, The 5 Principles in Parenting, where she does a ton on resilience. We have an episode with her all about that section of the book. So we won't recap that here, but we will talk about is why suck it up doesn't work, and why empathy does work. We're not just going to leave you hanging with the thing that doesn't work. So I just want to start with a little bit of research, because I think it's important to ground this conversation considering how many people believe that suck it up parenting works. I think it's important to ground this conversation in understanding how it does not work so well. And the first is actually a study that Melinda Wenner-Moyer cites in her book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. Best title of a book ever.
It's an excellent title.
It's an excellent title. And she gathers tons, as a science writer, she gathers tons and tons of data and research and studies. So if you feel like you're raising an asshole, great book to go back to. Hopefully you don't feel that way. But people who think that telling kids to suck it up helps them be able to handle and cope better later in life. There's a study of young men who were in families and were told as children by parents to essentially suck it up. Although the study does not use that phrase, the research tells us that those young men actually have more significant anger management issues than people who as children were not told to suck it up. Again, not the study's language. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is about expressing emotional feelings. But before we get to that, Cara, do you want to add something to the anger management, the Adam Sandler portion of the conversation?
I do. I mean, I think it just bears being super clear here. So if a parent, a guardian, a trusted adult, a coach, a mentor, an educator, a healthcare provider, a person of influence in a kid's life repeatedly told the kid, I mean, there's a difference between you're going to be okay and get over yourself, right? And I think what you're saying is it's not the gentle reassurance of it's all going to be all right. I'm here for you.
And by the way, I wouldn't even say you're going to be all right or you are all right or anything like that, but we can get to that.
Right.
Yeah.
We learned, I learned from my kid's preschool director, no, never say that. And I quote her all the time. It's this notion of get over it, right?
Right.
That has a direct tether to later in life, cast future forward, that people can't just get over it.
Right. So let's give an example. Let's say they, a kid, and the terminology used in the study is maternal punitive reactions. So maternal punitive reactions to negative emotions, to their kids' negative emotions, were directly associated with increased anger expressions as adults. And that might sound like, oh, for God's sakes, get over it. You're fine. Or I don't want to hear it. I've had a terrible day. You're an ungrateful little shit. Go up to your room, do your effing homework, and get the hell away from me.
Okay, but thank you for that very expressive rendition. Is there a version, Vanessa, for those of us who grew up in a home where a parent wasn't that freewheeling with language or with expressions of anger, but stewed with anger deep inside, that also had an impact? I mean, I think there's active, aggressive, sort of get over it. And there's also very passive, like, just come on,
Right.
Just a little bit of like, I'm deeply disappointed in you as a human right now because you haven't gotten over it. And I think,
or the cold shoulder. And I didn't do research for this episode about how the cold shoulder, relates to as a sort of suck it up reaction. But we do know that kids who receive the cold shoulder from parents who feel iced out, there's a lack of safety that they feel emotionally. So it's brutal. There's a lack of attachment to that parent. It feels unsafe. I just want to go back to my rant, which, if you imagine that it sort of tripped off my tongue very easily and I said it so fluidly, and you wondered, had I written that script? No, I hadn't written that script because I don't need to write that script, because I have said that stuff to my kids at some point or another, to each of them. So when I say, when we get angry or we dismiss them or we invalidate their feelings, all of those things, I have done all of those things. Cara has done all of those things. It's not that we don't ever do them. We might do them. We will also take a do-over and repair and apologize and own it, which then creates connection with our kids. It's just not our life and parenting philosophy to speak to children that way in order to build their sense of capability and resilience.
Yes, but Vanessa, let's be like a Cops episode here and say this is a dramatization, because you're right, like you do, but you don't. And our deliveries are different, and they're different. People who are listening have different deliveries, and there are people who deliver more in the sort of angry, aggressive style, and then it's done and it's out and it's like a little exorcism. And there are people who deliver in more of a disappointed style.
Right.
And, like everything we talk about on this podcast, how that is received and how that impacts the relationship between the kid and the adult is also very much a function of the kid's temperament and where they are in life and what's going on for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like, just to be super clear, I think it's fair to say everyone has had versions of themselves that they don't like, that they kind of replay that reel, and it's so cringy. But it's not always as obvious as the way you've described it.
So I want to move to a second piece of research, which is what suck it up parenting basically communicates to a kid is that there's no room for them to express whatever the emotion is that they're expressing. Because the suck it up parenting is in reaction to something the kid has done or said. And knowing tweens and teens the way we do, that often can be, an angry reaction, a deeply emotional reaction, what seems like an outsized response to a situation. And so when we shut that down, we might imagine that we're actually helping bring the temperature down. Except that there's research that tells us that people who end up accepting, acknowledging, expressing negative emotions have better emotional health than people who avoid or deny difficult emotions. That the folks who deny or avoid those emotions end up more stressed down the road. So if we think we're nipping it in the bud by saying, buck up, buddy, actually, in fact, we're creating more stress down the road than if we just let whatever was needing to come out, come out.
And again, I'm like constantly in search of the middle ground here, both personally and professionally, I will admit. And so there is a way to both accept and acknowledge and buck up a little bit.
Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. I'm just
You're
giving
just
everyone
laying
the
the
research underpinning so that when we give advice, it doesn't look like we're pulling it out of our asses.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And then the last piece of it, which is really, really fascinating. Both of these data points come from Lisa Damour's book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, which if you're the one person left in the world who hasn't read it, you should go read it.
It's excellent.
It's excellent. So there's two pieces of advice that are super helpful for this conversation that Lisa uses. And one is a study that she cites that talking about feelings actually has a calming effect on the brain. So again, we grew up in a generation, which is if you're expressing emotion, if you're talking about things, you're blowing it up. It's all out of proportion. You're being dramatic. But the study that she cites says, no, actually, just the process of doing that has a therapeutic effect on the person. So that's one super important thing to keep in mind. And then we're going to move to empathy, because empathy is where we move to action and constructive advice, which is where Cara is just itching to get to as she and the rest of us try to find the middle ground. And this is really, really fascinating. And Cara's going to, I know, get so excited to talk about this, which is that teens with empathetic parents, right? And we're going to talk in a second about
empathic, depending upon how you pronounce it.
We still don't know if that's both valid options or one is better for the other in different contexts.
Things to be true. Yes.
Yes, cognitive dissonance. That teens who have empathetic or empathic parents, I'm actually going to read the quote. Teens with empathic, Lisa uses empathic, so we should probably use empathic. Teens with empathic parents actually have lower levels of systemic inflammation, a biological marker of emotional stress, which means a parent expressing empathy can actually be all kids need to find emotional respite from their worry. Go, Cara.
Faux Dr. Bennett. You know why that statement is true. You know a lot about the adrenal glands.
I do. I'm really close friends with the adrenal glands.
You and the adrenals are buddy-buddy. Do you want to talk for a second, or do you want me to talk for a second about where the direct connection is?
I think as the actual physician, you should talk about the direct connection.
Oh, geez. Yeah. So, I mean, there is a clear, and I will be fully transparent that I do not have these studies sitting in front of me while we're doing this recording, but there's a clear direct connection between stress and the adrenal gland response and the release of stress hormones, particularly cortisol. And these stress hormones are directly connected with an inflammatory response in the body. So when you hear that stress exacerbates medical problems, for instance, stress causes, kids who break out because they've got stress acne. What is that? That is really an inflammatory response. You're turning the immune system up to 11, and every system is on go. Now, there is a part of the stress response that can actually turn down the immune system. And I want you to think about that like corticosteroids that someone might take when they have an asthma attack or when they have something where they are super inflamed everywhere in their body and we have to turn the volume down on that inflammation. The steroid medication that is used essentially forces the volume knob to turn counterclockwise and to lower that inflammatory response and to mop up a lot of that inflammation. There is, when the natural steroids in the body start being produced in response to stress, depending upon which natural steroids are being produced and what the circumstances are and what else is going on in that body, There are in some cases some immune suppression that can go on, a little bit of immune suppression, but generally speaking, the stress response is associated with an exaggerated immune response, which is why if you've got an empathic adult in a kid's life, if a kid is sitting there and the parent understands and gets them, or at least just listens and tries, their adrenal glands are not operating at an 11 and they are not secreting all of that cortisol like they're being chased by a tiger. If a parental response or an adult response is to yell or to scream or to be deeply disappointed or, all those adjectives, which might be appropriate responses. This is the problem. This is really where we're going to hit a conflict. Sometimes adults have to do that. But if that's the all the time response.
Yeah. And there's ways to do it that don't then send a kid into feeling unsafe or send their stress response even higher than it already was.
Or if that kid is having a super duper experience in every other corner of their life, and this is the only stressor, the way their body is going to respond is going to be a little less dramatic than if they're stressed out at school, they're stressed out on their team, they're stressed out by their friends, and this is like another piece of stress hay on the gigantic stress pile that is telling their adrenal glands, fire, 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 fire.
Yeah. So if we know that empathic parenting makes a difference, both in the biological wellness and the mental wellness of a kid. And we know that expressing emotions, whatever those emotions are, be them negative, angry, whatever, is actually therapeutic for a human being and maybe all they need. And that sort of punitive parenting can actually create more anger and aggression later in life, right? Mm-hmm. Those are all the underpinnings of why Suck It Up parenting doesn't work. So then what does work? And how do you get kids to answer your questions, for example? Because these comments on Instagram make it seem like, well, if you demand an answer from a teenager, well, then of course that teenager is going to answer you, except anyone who has come within a mile of a teenager knows that's an utter fallacy. You can't make them answer or respond or engage with you just because you deem it necessary or you want it so.
Right. And said a slightly more gentle way, we give all this advice about trying to engage in conversation with kids. And I think there's this big gray zone where it's like, well, if I'm not asking them for an answer, am I not engaging them? Right? Like, where does one begin and the other end? And it seems it's easy for us in this very reflective conversation to bring a rational structure to this. But in the heat of social media, where comments feed off of one another, and there's this pile-on effect, I think people lose sight of the fact that it's exactly what you've laid out. Just because you want them to say so, they're not going to tell you. And sometimes they will flat out lie in order to get out of the conversation.
Or go silent or leave or whatever. So let's talk a little bit, Cara, about how we can be empathic, how we can be in conversation, how we can learn about our kids' lives without dumping 4,000 questions on them that they have no interest in answering. And without suppressing maybe some hard emotions that come out in the process that are upsetting to us as parents, that maybe we don't want to hear, that maybe we'd rather they were giving us a different answer. So, Cara, let's start with, what does empathy sound like? Because yes, we are going to...
Let's start with that.
Because we are going to be disappointed in our kids. I mean, I just was texting with one of my kids who took an exam, and I wasn't super impressed with the way he was studying for said exam, and made a few suggestions about how he might want to consider studying differently for that exam. Suggestions he chose not to take on board. and chose to continue on the course he was on, which was pretty clear to me was not going to end in a really successful outcome. And then it turned out the exam did not go as well as he wanted. Shock of all shocks. And my first instinct, and this was all over text, was to, I don't have the luxury of seeing him at home later tonight. My first instinct was to write back and say, if you had only listened to my advice and done what at least one of the things I suggested, your outcome would have been different. But I did not say that, as tempted as I was, because that wasn't going to change anything. And that wasn't what he needed from me in that moment. He needed a tiny bit of empathy, just a tiny bit. I was not blanketing this child in praise.
Because you didn't agree with his strategy.
Because I didn't agree. I wasn't, offering to send him hot cocoa and donuts to make him feel better. I was giving him a little dropper full of empathy. And all I said was over text, oh, that's a bummer. What percentage of your grade is that exam going to be? And when it became clear it was not catastrophic, it was just disappointing, that was it. I made one comment, asked one question, and I was out.
Yeah, I think your example is perfect because the classic place where we do better with empathy, they do better in the long run with our empathy, but it's really hard to give it, is in the utterly predictable negative outcome.
Yeah.
Right? You know where that train is going. They kind of know you know. You don't agree with the choices they're making. And the question is, how in the world are you then, are you serious that the answer is empathy? And yes, triple yes. This is not, if there's a health or safety issue, this is not the advice, right? So if their health or safety is in danger, different approach. But for life learning, this is a winning approach. Here was my example this week. The norovirus joke at the top of the podcast. Okay, here's the backstory. Norovirus goes around this time of year. Lots of stomach bugs travel very, very effectively from person to person this time of year. One of my kids has a bunch of friends who are just dropping like flies from norovirus. Norovirus is a particularly messy viral infection. Let's just say, as a doctor, there are some infections where you say, are you having vomiting or are you having diarrhea? And generally, with norovirus, the answer is an and situation, not an or situation. It's like a bummer of an illness. And kids feel really terrible. Adults feel really terrible. People can get pretty sick from it. And it's going around. And my son, who is trying to dodge this infection as he navigates finals and trying to get home at the end of a semester, is truly asking for advice. But the advice that we're giving is not the advice he wants to hear. So similar example, right? And how do you empathize with, I get it that it's the last week of school. I get it that you need to do X, Y, and Z. I get it that you want to be around these people. And yet it's a really bad decision. And here, by the way, P.S., the consequences are very, very clear. Yes, you will be vomiting and having diarrhea, right? That is the reality. And he's watching it play out in front of him.
Right. And what you're doing is presenting him with the information.
Correct.
And you cannot make the choice for him. He has to make the choice. And it's not easy because if he makes a bad choice, that it's going to be messy.
It's going to be messy. And I will say that people always say, and Vanessa, and all of our regular listeners know, this is my child who was not a huge communicator when he was a younger teen. And the text I got after a couple of days of, trying really hard to be empathic, but at the same time giving advice he didn't want to hear, was, thank you for being reassuring. Isn't that interesting? Because the approach I took, the way I expressed empathy was this. I said, dude, I don't know if you're going to get norovirus. I cannot tell you. But I can tell you these are 3 things you can do. And one of them is, take some zinc. And one of them is stay away from people that are infected. And one of them, and we went through a little list and I was like, but I don't know what to tell you. So all I'm going to tell you is, I think based on everything you're telling me, your exposure was minimal, and let's see, and cross your fingers and just check in with me and let me know. And he heard that as empathic, and he thanked me for reassuring him. And it was so funny because I didn't sound that reassuring, but you know what I did? I learned this from you. I got out of solver mode. I think solver mode is not empathic. Solver mode, we might think we're being empathic, but what we're doing is taking over and telling them how to do it.
That's right.
And it's not super helpful.
Right. Because 2 things happen when we go into solver mode. We don't let whatever they're expressing run its course, right? We're sort of nipping in the bud the emotional flow of expression. And as Lisa tells us, that emotional expression is therapeutic in itself. And so in some ways, by just presenting him with information, you were letting his worry, his stress, his anxiety about getting sick and making certain choices, you were letting it run its course. And you were sort of alongside the banks of the river as it flowed downstream, giving him information, letting him know you were there without saying to him, if you get sick, don't expect me to come pick you up from the airport. And by the way, that dinner we had planned that you were so excited about, forget it. I'm canceling that dinner because you don't deserve it, because you didn't listen to me and you ignored right? Like that is the pathway towards, quote, being there, but just making them feel worse.
And I wasn't pretending to understand all the variables in his life. And frankly, it doesn't matter if you're 8 or 18 or 88. No one can really understand all the variables at play. And I think this was at the root of all the comments that were aimed at you after that post, which is like, there are a lot of forces at play. And no matter how close we are with someone, there's no mind meld here. There isn't enough time in the day and there isn't enough space in a relationship for one person to explain to the other all the forces at play.
Right.
And this is where leading with empathy, instead of saying, suck it up, you have no idea the other 15 things that are weighing on someone, even if they're your kid, even if they live in your house, even if you think you know.
Yeah. And I think that leads us to the last point, which is, how do you learn about someone's circumstances? Cara, it's like, you don't know everything that's going into your kid's experience. None of us do. They have lives that they live without us watching. And also, we're not privy to their inner lives, to their emotional lives. But we're also their parents and we love them and we want to know as much as we can, partially just because we love them and partially because we're there to support them. And all of these comments that were like, oh, I deserve to know everything going on in my kid's life. And it's like, okay, well, if you take that approach, you're going to know less than what you want to know for sure. So how do you do it? And I was thinking a lot about, we're recording this episode, my kids come home from college tomorrow. I've got 2 high schoolers who are finishing up the semester. And there's that moment where everyone just sort of like, the deep exhale happens and it seems like you just have like slugs living all over your house. Like no one is sitting up, like everyone's just prostrate all over the house. And
that's another time everyone gets sick, by the way.
Right. That's right. Yes. I'm totally prepared for everybody to come home and get sick. But the point is, once you've let them let down, once you are there in those quiet moments, those are often the moments to ask the questions. And the questions are not, are you dating anyone? Tell me, are you romantically interested in anyone? Are you feeling lonely at school? Do you have any friends? Have you found a best friend? What's going on? Right? It's like all of our crap coming up when we ask our kid about school. Or what's everybody doing over the vacation? I want to know, are you going to see anybody? Are you going to say, like, are you feeling connected to them? Are you worried about going back after them? Right? Like all of those questions that the suck it up.
70% of that might have come out of my mouth in the last visit. Yes.
But there are people who are like, oh, like I deserve to know the answer and my child will answer. And as Cara can tell you, And no, they won't. But you can say like, your friends are from all over the country. I'm wondering like what people's experiences are over break. Like, do people do similar things? Do they do different things? Or, if you have a middle schooler or a high schooler, it's like, whoa, there is a long break coming up. I wonder what other families do. Like, we're home for this break and we're doing a lot of hanging out. I wonder what other families do. Instead of saying, is there anyone for you to hang out with over break? Oh my God, I think you're going to be so bored and you're going to drive me crazy and I don't want you anywhere near me. So going in through the side door, asking sort of general questions, warming them up and getting a sense that gets you to conversation, not demanding answers to like super frontal questions.
But I think it's important to land here, which is, it is totally fair to desperately want answers to a lot of these questions.
100%.
It is totally fair, frankly, to expect answers to these questions. It's like, wait, I raised you. I fed you. I drive you everywhere.
Right.
You can't answer these questions. Just because the dynamic of telling them to suck it up and get over it and tell us or disclose or whatever word you want to plug in there, just because that doesn't work doesn't mean you're not going to feel this deep craving for answers to these things, because answers to these things make parents feel more connected to their kids. And I think the biggest lesson of all of those comments is, yes, getting the answer might make you feel better, but it doesn't. It may make you feel more connected, but it doesn't make your kid feel more connected to you. And I think that's the goal, is that it's a two-way street. I mean, I really believe that most of the people who commented were not just haters. I think they're just searching for meaningful connection with the kids in their lives. And they're frustrated that it's not as easy as saying, give it to me. But it's not as easy as saying, give it to me. And so these are strategies that get you through.
So for those of you who are in the suck it up camp, we're happy to hear from you. The research is not on your side. But as Cara said earlier, it's a gray area. And for different temperaments and different adults and different kids, what looks empathic and sounds empathic and what looks and feels like tough love, right? Those are going to be different in every family. But a dose of empathy never goes amiss. And it's always worth adding a little more.
That's what I'm going to give you for the holidays, Vanessa.
A dose of empathy. You're my own little Mary Poppins. A spoonful of empathy.
I'm going to give you a bottle of empathy and a dropper.
Right, because I just had a tiny dropper of empathy earlier.
Oh my God, I'm totally going to do that.
Thanks, Cara.
Bye, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.